My name is Madison Clark. I'm 30 years old. At a family dinner in a restaurant with white tablecloths and silverware that felt too heavy in my hands, my mom leaned across the table, her smile like a crack in ice. She said, "You're only here because I felt sorry for you." The sting of it was instant, a hot flush that climbed up my neck and burned my cheeks. Then, as if to prove her point, she pulled out a crisp white envelope and handed it to my brother. Inside were 2 concert tickets, the very tickets I had dreamed of for years. He didn't even look at me. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, our house always felt like it was built on a tilt. It wasn't the foundation of the house itself, it was the foundation of our family. Everything and everyone leaned toward my younger brother, Jason. The entire structure of our lives was designed to support him, to elevate him, to make sure he never felt the slightest wobble. I, on the other hand, learned how to keep my balance on the slanted floor. Our parents, Elaine and Thomas Clark, were the architects of this imbalance. To my mother, Elaine, Jason was the son. He was her charming one, her little man, the future of the family. Her voice changed when she spoke to him, softening into a syrupy coo that she never used with me. My father, Thomas, was quieter. He was a man who preferred peace above all else. And in our house, peace meant agreeing with my mother. It meant letting Jason have his way. I remember my 8th birthday. I had asked for a party with my friends from school, just a small one with cake and maybe a few games in the backyard. My mother had sighed, that long, weary sound she made whenever I asked for anything that required effort. "Madison, it's a school night coming up. It's too much hassle." We had a small cake after dinner, instead. Just the 4 of us. The entire time, my dad and Jason talked about Jason's upcoming soccer tryouts. They didn't ask me what I wanted to do in the coming year or what my favorite part of being 7 had been. They just sang a quick, off-key, happy birthday, and my mother took a single picture before telling me to hurry and blow out the candles so she could clear the table. 2 months later, Jason turned 6. Our backyard was transformed. There was a bouncy castle that took up the entire lawn, a mountain of presents wrapped in bright blue paper, and nearly 20 kids from his class screaming with joy. My mother floated through the crowd, a perfect hostess, lassing and refilling juice boxes. She looked happier than I had ever seen her. My father was manning the grill, flipping burgers and telling other dads how Jason was a natural-born athlete. I was assigned the job of watching the gift table. I sat there on a folding chair, a forgotten decoration, watching my brother be celebrated for simply existing. This was the pattern of our lives. When Jason won a ribbon in a school field day, it was framed and hung in the living room. When I won first place in the district-wide spelling bee, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," and put the certificate in a drawer in the kitchen where it was eventually stained with coffee rings. When Jason got a C on a math test, my father would ruffle his hair and say, "Don't worry, champ. Numbers aren't your thing. You're a people person." When I got an A- in advanced chemistry, my mother would look at the report card, her finger tracing the minus sign. "What happened here? Why not an A+? You have to push yourself harder." Jason learned early on that he didn't have to try. His charm was his currency. He could flash a smile and my mother would melt. He could crack a joke and my father would forget he was supposed to be scolding him. He broke our neighbor's window with a baseball, and my parents paid for it without a word of reprimand. I accidentally spilled a glass of milk on the carpet, and I was grounded for a week for being clumsy. I was dismissed as too sensitive. My hurt was an inconvenience. If I cried because Jason had taken my favorite book and drawn all over the pages, my mother would say, "Oh, Madison, don't be so dramatic. It's just a book." But it was never just about the book, or the forgotten birthday, or the B- grade. It was about the constant grinding message that I was less. My wants were less important. My feelings were less valid. My existence was secondary. So I learned to disappear. I became quiet and observant. I did my homework, I kept my room clean, I did everything I was supposed to do, hoping that if I caused no trouble, I might earn a sliver of affection that flowed so freely toward Jason. But it didn't work. Good behavior was just expected. It was my baseline. Jason's rare moments of decency were treated like miracles. In this quiet, lonely world, music became my escape. It was the only thing that was truly mine. We had an old record player in the basement, and I'd spend hours down there, listening to my dad's forgotten vinyl. That's where I discovered them. The band. Their music wasn't just noise, it was a language I understood. The lyrics spoke of feeling out of place, of searching for something more, of a pain that felt familiar. The lead singer's voice was raw and honest, and it filled the empty spaces inside me. Listening to them was like having a friend who understood without me having to say a word. I covered my bedroom walls with their posters. I knew every word to every song. Their music was the soundtrack to my life. It got me through lonely nights of homework, family dinners where I felt invisible, and holidays that revolved entirely around Jason. They were my secret, my sanctuary. And when I heard they were doing one last, final farewell tour, a deep, desperate ache settled in my chest. I had to be there. It wasn't just a concert, it felt like a pilgrimage I needed to make for the girl who had survived so much, alone in her room with only their songs for company. The announcement of the farewell tour felt like a punch to the gut and a spark of hope all at once. This was it. The last chance. The band I had grown up with, the one that had held my hand through the worst of my teenage years, was saying goodbye. Seeing them live wasn't a wish. It was a need. It felt like the closing of a chapter, and I needed to be there to witness it. At the time, I was working as a barista at a small coffee shop downtown called The Daily Grind. The work was hard and thankless. My days started at 5 a.m., the air still dark and cold. I'd spend 8 hours on my feet, dealing with the morning rush of caffeine-starved zombies, impatient business people, and the occasional friendly regular who made the day bearable. My hands were perpetually calloused from the hot steam wand, and the smell of burnt coffee clung to my clothes and hair long after my shift ended. The pay was just enough to cover my rent for a tiny studio apartment, my bills, and my groceries. There wasn't much left over for luxuries. But for this, I would make an exception. This was not a luxury. This was essential. I started saving immediately. I created a separate jar, an old pickle jar I'd washed out, and labeled it Tour Fund. Every dollar I could spare went into it. I stopped buying my lunch, packing cheap peanut butter sandwiches instead. I walked the 2 miles to work instead of taking the bus, even when it rained, which it often did in Portland. I picked up extra shifts whenever someone called in sick, working until my feet throbbed and my back ached. I'd come home exhausted, eat a bowl of cereal for dinner, and count the crumpled bills and loose change in the jar. Slowly, painfully, it grew. The tickets were expensive, the kind of expensive that makes your stomach drop, but I was determined. I told myself it would be worth it. For one night, I would be in a room with thousands of other people who understood. We would all sing the same words, feeling the same surge of emotion. For one night, I would be part of something. I wouldn't be the forgotten daughter or the invisible girl. I would just be a fan, connected and alive. When the day of the sale arrived, I was a nervous wreck. I had requested the morning off work, a move that earned me a glare from my manager. At 9:59 a.m., I was sitting at my small kitchen table, my laptop open, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had 3 different browser tabs open to the ticket website. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my hands shaking slightly. The clock ticked over to 10 a.m. I refreshed the page. A loading screen. A spinning wheel. It felt like an eternity. Finally, at the page loaded, I clicked on the Find Tickets button. The site immediately slowed down, crawling under the weight of thousands of desperate fans. A small blue bar appeared, showing my place in the virtual queue. There were, it said, over 20,000 people ahead of me. My hope began to curdle into dread. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the little blue man on the screen walk in place, making no progress. I kept refreshing, a useless, anxious habit. Every now and then, a pop-up would appear. Tickets are selling fast. By the time I finally got through the queue, it was over. A stark, cruel message was displayed on the screen in bold red letters. Sold out. I just stared at it. All those early mornings, all those skipped lunches, all that careful saving. It was all for nothing. I closed the laptop, the soft click of the lid sounding like a final, definitive end. I leaned my head against the cool wood of the table and felt a familiar, hollow ache spread through my chest. It was the feeling of wanting something with every fiber of your being and being denied. It was a feeling I knew all too well. For weeks, I was heartbroken. I avoided listening to their music because it was too painful. Every time one of their songs came on the radio at the coffee shop, I had to excuse myself to the back room for a moment, just to breathe. Then, about a month later, something strange happened. I was at my parents' house for our obligatory Sunday dinner. I was in the kitchen, helping my mom load the dishwasher, or rather, watching her reload it after I'd done it wrong. She was on the phone with one of her friends, her voice light and bubbly. "Oh, you won't believe the tickets I managed to get," she said, and my ears perked up. "Yes, for their farewell tour. I know, they sold out in seconds. I had to pull a few strings, but I got them. Premium seats, too, right near the stage." My heart stopped. It couldn't be. Could it? I stood there, a soapy plate in my hand, my mind racing. Maybe she had heard me talking about how much I wanted to go. Maybe, just maybe, she had done this for me. A tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren ground of my chest. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope in my family was almost always a precursor to disappointment. But I couldn't help it. I imagined her giving them to me. I imagined the look on her face, a rare, genuine smile. Maybe this was a peace offering. Maybe this was her way of saying she saw me, that she cared. The thought was so powerful, it almost made me dizzy. For the rest of the evening, I was quiet, holding this precious secret possibility close to my heart. I watched her, looking for a sign, a hint. But she said nothing more about it. The tickets remained a mystery, a Schrodinger's gift that was both for me and not for me. I left their house that night, clinging to that sliver of hope, completely unprepared for how brutally it was about to be destroyed. Another few weeks passed, the concert date was getting closer, and the subject of the tickets never came up again. The small seed of hope I had foolishly allowed to grow had started to wither. I assumed my mother had bought them for herself and my father, or maybe for one of her friends. It was naive of me to think they could have been for me. That kind of thoughtful gesture just wasn't in her nature, not when it came to me. I fell back into my routine. Wake up, walk to work, make coffee, smile at customers, walk home, eat alone, sleep. The days blended into a gray, monotonous stream. It was easier that way. Expecting nothing meant I couldn't be disappointed. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "Dinner on Friday, the Rose Garden downtown, 7 p.m. I stared at the message, reading it over and over. This was highly unusual. My mother never invited me out, especially not to a place like the Rose Garden. It was one of the fanciest restaurants in Portland, the kind of place you go for major anniversaries or promotions. And the just us part was even stranger. My father and Jason were always included in everything. A dinner with just my mother felt loaded, significant. Immediately, my mind went back to the tickets. Could this be it? Was she finally going to give them to me? The timing was perfect. The concert was only a few weeks away. The fancy restaurant, the private dinner, it all felt like a setup for a grand gesture. The hope I had tried so hard to bury clawed its way back to the surface, stronger and more insistent this time. My hands were trembling as I typed back a reply. Sounds lovely. See you then. The rest of the week was a blur of nervous anticipation. I couldn't focus at work. I kept replaying the potential conversation in my head. I imagined her sliding the envelope across the table, her eyes soft for once. I know how much this band means to you, Madison. I wanted to do something special. I would tear up, of course. I would thank her, and for a moment, we would be a normal mother and daughter connected by a shared happy moment. This fantasy became my lifeline. I clung to it. It made the long hours at work feel lighter. It made my small, empty apartment feel less lonely. The thought that my mother might actually see me, that she had done something purely for my happiness, was intoxicating. On Friday, I spent hours getting ready. I went through my entire closet, discarding outfit after outfit. Nothing felt good enough for the restaurant, for the occasion. I finally settled on a simple black dress I'd bought for a wedding a few years ago. It was the nicest thing I owned. I did my hair carefully, putting on a little more makeup than usual. I wanted to look nice. I wanted to look like a daughter she could be proud of, for just one night. As I stood in front of the small mirror in my bathroom, I saw a stranger looking back. A woman with hopeful eyes. I almost didn't recognize her. For a fleeting second, a wave of cynicism washed over me. Don't do this to yourself, a voice in my head warned. You know how this ends. But I pushed it down. Tonight would be different. It had to be. I arrived at the Rose Garden right at 7 p.m. The restaurant was beautiful, with low lighting, fresh flowers on every table, and the quiet, respectful hum of conversation. The hostess led me to a small table where my mother was already seated, sipping a glass of white wine. She looked up as I approached, and her smile was sharp, not warm. It was a practiced social smile, the one she used with acquaintances, not family. The hopeful feeling in my chest faltered. She said, "Madison, you're on time," as if it were a surprise. "Hi, Mom," I said, sitting down. "This place is beautiful." "It is," she said, her eyes scanning my dress with a look that felt more like an inspection than an appreciation. "You look presentable." It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. It was just a neutral observation devoid of any warmth. The waiter came, and we ordered. The small talk was stilted and awkward. She asked about my job in a way that made it clear she found it trivial. I asked about her garden club. It was like a conversation between two strangers who had been forced to sit together. There was no warmth, no connection. The beautiful fantasy I had built up all week began to crumble, turning to dust around me. The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't a reconciliation dinner. This was something else. And as I picked up the expensive meal I suddenly had no appetite for, I had a growing, sickening feeling that I had walked right into a trap. The dinner dragged on. I tried to fill the silences, talking about a new book I was reading, a funny thing a customer had said at the coffee shop. My mother just nodded, a polite but distant look on her face. She was physically present, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept checking her phone, a small, tight smile playing on her lips as she texted someone, probably Jason. I felt small and foolish. I had dressed up, I had hoped, I had allowed myself to believe in a fantasy. And for what? To sit here and be ignored? The food, which should have been delicious, tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I just wanted to go home. Finally, as the waiter cleared our main course plates, my mother put her phone down and looked at me directly. Her eyes were cold, almost clinical. This was it. This was the moment the evening had been leading up to. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low and confidential, as if she were sharing a secret. "Madison," she began, and I held my breath. "I want to be clear about this dinner. I don't want you getting the wrong idea." I just stared at her, confused. The wrong idea? Her smile was thin, cruel. Yes, don't think this means anything has changed between us. You're only here because I felt sorry for you. The words hit me with a physical force. It was like being slapped in the face, but worse. The sound in the restaurant seemed to fade away. All I could hear was a loud ringing in my ears. I felt the blood drain from my face and a hot, shameful flush creep up my neck. I looked down at my hands, which were clenched into fists in my lap, to hide their trembling. I couldn't speak. What was there to say? She had just confirmed my deepest, darkest fear. I was a burden to her. A charity case. My presence in her life was an act of pity. Before I could even process the full weight of her cruelty, she continued, her tone becoming brighter, more theatrical. Anyway, she said, as if she had just commented on the weather, speaking of things that aren't for you, she reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a crisp white envelope. My heart, which I thought couldn't sink any lower, dropped into the pit of my stomach. It was the envelope, the one containing the tickets. My eyes widened. I couldn't believe she would do this. Not here, not now. But she did. At that exact moment, Jason walked up to the table. He must have been waiting at the bar. My mother's face lit up with genuine warmth, a startling contrast to the cold mask she had worn for me all evening. "Jason, sweetheart, perfect timing," she chirped. He leaned down and kissed her cheek, completely ignoring me. He was wearing an expensive jacket I'd never seen before, and he smelled of cologne. He looked confident and at ease. The golden sun, right on cue. "What's up, Mom?" he asked, smirking. She held up the envelope dramatically, like a magician presenting her final trick. "I have something for you," she said, her voice full of pride. She handed it to him. Jason took it, a look of mild interest on his face. He tore it open casually. Inside, I could see the corner of the tickets, the band's logo printed in bold letters. My tickets, the ones I had worked for, dreamed of. My mother beamed at him. She said, "You deserve these, sweetheart," her voice dripping with affection. Her eyes flickered to me for a second, a glint of triumph in them. "Unlike some people, you actually bring us pride. I know you'll have a great time." The message was clear. It was a performance, and I was the humiliated audience. This entire dinner, the fancy restaurant, the invitation, it was all a stage, meticulously set to deliver this final crushing blow. Jason glanced at the tickets and then pocketed the envelope without word of thanks. He just gave my mother a nod. "Cool," he said. He looked at me then, for the first time all night, a smug, dismissive smirk on his face. It was the look of a victor. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew how much I loved that band. My mother had surely told him. This was a team effort. I felt like I was suffocating. The air was too thick to breathe. I needed to get out. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. Both of them looked at me, surprised by the sudden noise. I forced a smile. It felt like my face was cracking. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. I have to get going. Early shift tomorrow." It was a lie, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay there for one more second. "Oh," my mother said, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. It seems my reaction wasn't dramatic enough for her. She had wanted tears, probably. "All right, dear. Drive safe." I turned and walked away, not looking back. I could feel their eyes on me. I walked through the beautiful restaurant, past the happy couples and celebrating families, my head held high. I didn't let myself break. Not yet. I waited until I was outside, in the cold, damp Portland air. I walked a few blocks, turned a corner into a dark, empty street, and then I leaned against a brick wall and finally let myself fall apart. The walk home was a blur. I don't remember the streets I took or the cars that passed. I was moving on autopilot, my body carrying me forward while my mind was stuck in that restaurant, replaying the scene over and over again. My mother's cold voice, Jason's smirk, the white envelope. The feeling of being utterly and completely worthless. By the time I reached my apartment building, a cold drizzle had started to fall, plastering my hair to my face. I fumbled with my keys, my hands still shaking. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, the silence of my small apartment amplifying the roaring in my head. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the darkness to my bathroom and flipped the switch. The sudden, harsh fluorescent light made me flinch. I looked in the mirror and I barely recognized the person staring back at me. Her face was pale and blotchy, her eyes wide with a kind of numb shock. Her mascara was smeared from the rain, creating dark tracks down her cheeks like tear stains. She looked broken. And that's when the dam finally broke. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. It was a raw, ugly sob that tore its way out of my chest. I gripped the sides of the sink, my knuckles white, and I cried. I cried for the tickets, yes, but it was so much more than that. The tickets were just the symbol, the final piece of evidence in a lifetime of dismissals. I cried for the little girl who had her birthday parties ignored. I cried for the teenager who had her achievements minimized. I cried for the young woman who had tried so desperately to earn a single crumb of approval from the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. Every dismissal, every casual cruelty, every time I was made to feel second best, it all came rushing back. I remembered being 15 and getting my driver's permit. I was so proud. I'd studied for weeks. When I asked my dad if he would take me practice driving, he sighed and said he was too tired after work. The next day, Jason, who was only 13, asked my dad to take him to the park to practice baseball pitches. My dad's face lit up. Of course, champ, let's go. They were gone for hours. I sat in my room, staring at the permit in my hand, feeling that familiar, sickening twist in my gut. I remembered my high school graduation. I was the salutatorian of my class. I had to give a speech. I had practiced it for weeks, my hands shaking as I read it aloud to my empty bedroom. After the ceremony, my parents gave me a brief, obligatory hug. Good job, Madison. Then they immediately started talking about Jason's upcoming summer camp. There was no celebration dinner for me, no acknowledgement of my hard work. It was just another box ticked. My achievement was a quiet, lonely thing. Looking at my reflection, I saw all those younger versions of myself, all of them standing behind me, their eyes full of the same hurt. We had spent so many years begging for scraps of love, for a sign that we mattered. We had twisted ourselves into knots, trying to be worthy, trying to be good enough, quiet enough, smart enough, not too sensitive, not too needy. And it had all been for nothing. Tonight, my mother had held up a mirror and shown me exactly what I was to her. I was an afterthought, a pity project, an inconvenience. She hadn't just given the tickets to Jason, she had orchestrated the entire evening to humiliate me, to put me firmly back in my place. She needed me to be small so that Jason could look big. She needed me to be a disappointment so that he could be the star. My role in the family was to be the dark background against which my brother could shine. The sobs racked my body until I was empty, exhausted. I slid down to the cold tile floor, my back against the cabinet, and just sat there in the harsh light. The tears stopped, but the pain remained, a dull, heavy weight in my chest. I thought about fighting back. I could call her. I could scream at her. I could tell her how cruel she was, how much she had hurt me. But what would be the point? She wouldn't understand. She would just call me too sensitive or dramatic. She would twist my pain into a weapon against me, proving her point that I was unstable and ungrateful. Confronting her would be like screaming at a brick wall. The only person who would end up hurt was me. For years, I had been playing a game that was rigged against me, a game where the rules were constantly changing, but the outcome was always the same. I lost. And tonight, sitting on my bathroom floor, I finally realized the truth. The only way to win was to stop playing. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the gray light of dawn slowly fill my apartment. The exhaustion was bone deep, but my mind was surprisingly clear. The storm of grief from the night before had passed, leaving behind a strange and unfamiliar calm. The pain was still there, a low, steady hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer overwhelming me. It was just a fact. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I could have done differently to please them. I wasn't wondering how I could win their approval. I was done. That part of my life, the part where I chased after a love that was never meant for me, was over. The realization didn't feel sad. It felt liberating. It was like I had been carrying 100-pound weight on my back for my entire life, and I had finally decided to set it down. I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the forced cheerfulness, the small talk. I needed a day to just be. I made a pot of coffee, the real stuff, not the cheap instant kind I usually had. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, and I started to write. I didn't know what I was doing at first. I just wrote down what happened at the dinner. I described the restaurant, the look on my mother's face, the words she said. I wrote about Jason's smirk and the feel of the ticket envelope in his hand. I wrote without censoring myself, without worrying if I sounded too dramatic or too sensitive. I just let the truth pour out onto the page. Then I wrote about my childhood. I wrote about the bouncy castle and the spelling bee certificate. I wrote about the framed ribbon and the driver's permit. I filled page after page with the small, silent hurts that had built the foundation of my life. Writing it all down was painful, but it was also clarifying. Seeing the events lined up, one after another, made the pattern undeniable. This wasn't a series of misunderstandings or unintentional slights. This was a deliberate, consistent system of emotional neglect and favoritism. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't too sensitive. My pain was real, and it was valid. By the end of the day, I had filled half the notebook. I felt drained, but also strangely empowered. For my entire life, my story had been controlled by them. They had defined me as the quiet one, the difficult one, the disappointing one. But here, on these pages, I was the one telling the story. I was the one in control of the narrative. An idea began to form in my mind. A small, quiet plan. What if I shared this? Not with my family, but with strangers. What if there were other people out there who had lived on the tilted floors of their own families? What if they also felt alone? The thought was terrifying. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. To share these private, painful moments with the world felt like the ultimate act of vulnerability, but it also felt like the only way forward. I had to take the shame and secrecy that had been forced on me and turn it into something else. That evening, I opened my laptop and created a free blog. I called it The Tilted Floor. I spent hours designing a simple, clean layout. Then I took a deep breath and wrote my first post. It was titled, "You're Only Here Because I Felt Sorry for You." I took the raw, unfiltered words from my notebook and typed them out. I wrote about the dinner, the tickets, and the soul-crushing humiliation. I ended the post with a simple question. Have you ever been made to feel like a ghost at your own family's table? My finger hovered over the publish button for a long time. This would change things. There was no going back. If my family ever found this, the fallout would be immense. But then I thought about the alternative. To go back to being their quiet, forgotten daughter, to swallow my pain and pretend everything was fine. And I knew I couldn't do it. Not anymore. I clicked the button. I closed the laptop immediately, my heart hammering in my chest. I felt a wave of panic. What had I done? I didn't look at the blog for 3 days. I was too scared. But when I finally worked up the courage to check, I was stunned. There were comments, dozens of them. A woman from Ohio wrote, "The ghost at the table. That's exactly how I feel. My brother is the hero of our family, and I'm just the scenery. Thank you for putting it into words." A man from California wrote, "My parents did the same thing to me with a car they promised me, then gave to my sister. I've never told anyone how much that hurt. Reading your story, I cried for the first time in years." Me too. This is my life. Thank you for being brave enough to share this. The comments kept coming. Each one was a small light in the darkness. I wasn't alone. There were so many of us, all living on our own tilted floors, all taught to be silent about our pain. A new kind of resolve settled inside me. I had found something that mattered. I started writing regularly. I wrote about the golden child syndrome, about toxic family dynamics, about setting boundaries. I wrote about the long, slow process of healing and learning to value myself when my own family wouldn't. I was honest and raw, and with every post, I felt a little stronger. My blog started to grow. People shared my posts on social media. My readership went from dozens to hundreds, then to thousands. I was building a small but powerful community, a family of strangers bound together by shared experience. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. My words mattered. My story mattered. I was no longer a ghost. I was a voice. The next year of my life was a quiet revolution. On the outside, not much changed. I still worked at the daily grind, I still lived in my tiny apartment, and I still had no contact with my family. They hadn't reached out after the disastrous dinner, and I had made no effort to contact them. A silent, mutual wall had been erected. But on the inside, everything was different. My blog, The Tilted Floor, had become my life's work. I poured all my spare energy into it. I spent my evenings writing, researching, and responding to the hundreds of emails and comments that flooded my inbox every week. People shared their own stories with me, stories of heartbreak and resilience that mirrored my own. I was no longer just telling my story. I was holding a space for others to tell theirs. It was the most meaningful work I had ever done. About 8 months after I started the blog, I received an email that made my heart stop. It was from a producer for a popular podcast called Unspoken, which focused on telling the stories people are often too afraid to share. She had been following my blog for months and said my writing had deeply moved her. She wanted to know if I would be willing to come on the show as a guest. I was terrified and thrilled at the same time. The podcast had millions of listeners. The thought of speaking my story out loud, of giving it a voice, was daunting. But I knew I had to do it. This was the next step. The interview was done over a video call. The host, a woman with a kind and gentle voice, made me feel instantly at ease. I told her everything. I told her about the tickets, about the years of feeling invisible, about the moment on the bathroom floor when I decided to stop playing their game. I didn't cry. My voice was steady and clear. It was the voice of a survivor, not a victim. The episode aired a few weeks later. The response was overwhelming. My blog traffic exploded. My email inbox was flooded with messages of support. But the most significant thing to come out of it was an email from a literary agent in New York. Her name was Sarah, and she wrote, "Madison, I just listened to your story on Unspoken, and I am speechless. I've since read your entire blog from start to finish. You have a powerful, necessary voice. I believe there is a book in your story. Have you ever considered writing one?" A book? The idea had never even crossed my mind. Me, a barista from Portland, writing a book? It seemed impossible. But Sarah was persistent. We had a long phone call, and she laid out a vision for a memoir, a guide for others who had survived toxic family dynamics. She believed in me. For the first time, someone in a position of power was telling me that my voice deserved to be heard on a larger scale. So I started writing a book proposal. With Sarah's guidance, I crafted a detailed outline and wrote 3 sample chapters. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. I had to dig deeper into my past to relive memories I had long buried. But with every word I wrote, I felt myself healing a little more. Sarah submitted the proposal to publishers in New York. I tried not to get my hopes up, but it was hard not to dream. A few weeks later, she called me while I was on my lunch break at the coffee shop. "Are you sitting down?" she asked, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Yes," I said, my heart pounding. "We have an offer, a very good one, from one of the biggest publishers in the country. Madison, you're going to be a published author." I started to cry, right there in the crowded break room. But these weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The next few months were a whirlwind. I quit my job at the Daily Grind. My last day was surreal. As I handed in my apron, my manager, who had always been so dismissive, looked at me with a newfound respect. She had heard me on the podcast. "Good for you," she said, and for once, it sounded genuine. I wrote the book. I poured my entire soul onto the pages. I called it The Tilted Floor, Finding Your Feet When Your Family Knocks You Down. The day of my book launch was set for a year and a half after that horrible dinner. The launch party was held at a large independent bookstore in downtown Portland. The place was packed. It was filled with friends I had made through my new life, fellow writers, people from my online community who had driven for hours to be there, and even some of my extended family. My Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, came up to me and gave me a huge hug. "Maddie, I am so proud of you," she whispered in my ear. "I always knew they didn't treat you right." Cousins, who had barely spoken to me in years, were suddenly eager to take pictures with me, posting them on social media with captions like, "So proud of my amazing cousin, the author." It was strange seeing my success reflected in their eyes. But as I stood at the front of the room, looking out at the sea of supportive faces, I realized something. My parents and Jason weren't there. I hadn't invited them. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it out of self-preservation. This night was about celebrating my new life, the one I had built for myself. Their presence would have been a shadow over it, a reminder of the past I had worked so hard to overcome. Later that night, as I scrolled through social media, I saw the photos my cousins had posted. They were full of smiling faces, people holding up my book. The tables had well and truly turned. The forgotten daughter was finally being seen. And I didn't need the approval of my mother, father, or brother to feel it. I had earned this on my own. The night of the concert, the one Jason had gone to with my mother's gifted tickets, was a cool, clear evening in October. I knew because I had checked the date on the calendar. A small, private acknowledgement of the moment that had changed my life. I imagined them there, in the massive, impersonal arena, surrounded by the roar of the crowd. Maybe they were having a good time. Maybe they weren't. Maybe my mother was complaining about the volume, or Jason was bored scrolling on his phone. It was strange, but when I pictured them, I didn't feel a sting of envy or a pang of sadness. I felt nothing at all. They felt like characters in a story from a long, long time ago. Because on that same night, I was over 2,000 miles away, in a cozy bookstore in New York City. My book tour had been more successful than I could have ever imagined. City after city, I was met with lines of people who wanted to meet me to have me sign their copy of The Tilted Floor. They waited patiently, and when they got to the front of the line, they didn't just ask for an autograph, they shared their stories with me. Your chapter on guilt saved me, a young woman in Chicago told me, her eyes welling with tears. I finally gave myself permission to walk away from my toxic sister. I gave your book to my husband, an older man in Boston said, his voice thick with emotion. It helped him understand what I went through with my father. It's helping us heal. Tonight in New York, the line stretched out the door. As I signed book after book, I listened, I nodded, I looked each person in the eye and thanked them for sharing a piece of their heart with me. Near the end of the night, a woman who looked to be about my age approached the table. She clutched my book to her chest like a shield. She said, "I just wanted to say thank you," her voice quiet but steady. "I read your first blog post, the one about the dinner. My family did something similar to me for my wedding. They told me I was being selfish for wanting the day to be about me. Your story, it gave me the strength to realize I wasn't the crazy one." I looked at her, and I saw a reflection of myself. I saw the years of hurt, the struggle to be seen, and the quiet resilience that had carried her through. "Thank you for telling me that," I said, my voice full of a sincerity that surprised even me. As she walked away, a profound sense of peace washed over me. This was my concert. This was my arena. The roar of the crowd in Portland was just noise. The quiet, heartfelt words of these strangers, these survivors, this was my music. For so many years, I had desperately wanted my family's approval. I had craved a sign, any sign, that I mattered to them. I had molded myself, silenced myself, and shrunk myself all in the hopes of earning a love that was never on offer. The cruelty of that dinner, the deliberate, calculated way my mother had tried to break me, was meant to be an ending. It was meant to be the final confirmation of my worthlessness. But it wasn't. It was a beginning. Her cruelty had been a gift in disguise. It had been the push I needed to finally let go, to stop begging for a seat at a table that I was never truly welcome, and to go out and build my own. I had found my own family. It wasn't found by blood, but by shared experience, by mutual respect, by the simple, powerful act of seeing someone's pain and saying, "I understand. You are not alone." These people in this bookstore and the thousands more who read my words online, they were my family now. They valued my voice. They saw my strength. I chose peace by cutting ties with my parents and brother. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation or a final tearful goodbye. My resolution came in the form of silence, a quiet, powerful, and complete withdrawal of my energy from their toxic world. My silence, I realized, spoke louder than any angry words ever could. It said, "You no longer have the power to hurt me. I am no longer playing your game." Sitting there, in that warm, bright bookstore, I finally felt whole. The tilted floor in my mind had leveled out. I was standing on solid ground, a foundation I had built myself, one true word at a time. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was the author of my own story. Have you ever been mocked or excluded by your own family, only to rise stronger? Share your story in the comments. Hit like and subscribe for more stories of betrayal, survival, and poetic justice.